get back up here for the discussion tonight. I guess am I going to get introduced, or should I introduce myself? You can introduce it. I guess that's how they planned it.
Are you rolling there, Cloyd? Okay. Good evening, and welcome to Contact in the Desert. Sometimes we save the very best for last, because what you're about to experience really is applicable to you, how your world is shifting and changes in ways you've never even dreamed possible. Danny Shehan is the preeminent attorney who has worked on cases so famous as the Iran-Contra case, the Pentagon Papers, the famed Karen Silkwood case. He was the famed winner there for Karen Silkwood. More importantly, he's a freedom fighter for justice and human rights. He is also a teacher in international and domestic policy, world events, and what's going on right now. Let's not wait any longer. Brace for impact, because this is Danny Shehan.
Thank you. All right. Okay. So, I want to talk about tonight the fact that ever since our human species, Homo sapien, has evolved the faculty of self-consciousness. This ability to distinguish ourselves as separate and apart, as a separate self from the rest of the universe, which is the undergirding experience of our intellect, the Latin root of which is intellectus, the ability to distinguish the difference between. And as you know, we've taken great pride in basically identifying ourselves, conflating our very sense of self-identity with the development of our intellect. And so we take great pride in the fact that we have developed this particular faculty of being able to distinguish ourselves as separate and apart from everything else, in fact, from every other species, and indeed from every other thing in the entire universe, that we are, in fact, unique in that sense, we think. We've even gone so far as to have created an entire human mythology that places us over and above every other created animal and being in the entire world. In fact, we have gone so far as to state that this placing ourselves in dominion over all of the other creatures of the world meaning the universe in this sense, was in fact the specific decision made on the part of a supreme being that just happens to be like us. In fact, exists in the same likeness of us. We have been created in the same likeness of this supreme being. And we've gone farther in the creation of this particular mythology to at one time have placed ourselves in the very physical center of the entire universe, and that every other heavenly body in the celestial realm revolved around us. Now that, and that in fact the entire physical universe was created by this supreme being solely to serve as a platform or stage upon which was to be played out this major drama of our human salvation. That we were supposed to engage in a protracted process pursuant to which we would, through an exercise of our own free will, would make a decision as to whether or not we would totally destroy ourselves, either through thermonuclear self-immolation, or in fact by destroying our entire ecosystem through the pollution of various petrochemicals that we were using to light our night and speed our vehicles and forge the beauty of our planet into power for us. The fact of the matter is that this quest was, in fact, designed to have us come to an eventual point where we would ideally realize through our own direct experience that ultimately we were not, in fact, separate and apart from everything else in the universe, and that we were not even separate and apart from this infinite being that purportedly created us and placed us here in this universe, and that we would ultimately, if we succeeded in this major quest, we would come to realize that this infinite being was not, in fact, a noun, but was, in fact, a verb of unconditioned being, a non-transitive verb, as it were. Now, this was the mythology that we have created for ourselves, which implicitly sets up a process by means of which we will be able to eventually overcome the sense of separateness that has been generated by the evolution of our intellect. Now, this specific mythology, as you know, was fundamentally challenged back in the 16th century, in 1543, by Nicholas Copernicus, a Catholic priest and an astronomer, who actually published a work called On the Revolution of the Celestial Spheres in 1543, in which he postulated that it appeared to him that our Earth was not, in fact, in the center of the universe, geophysically. That, in fact, our sun was in the center of the universe, and that everything else revolved around it. And as you know, this particular insight was further developed 100 years later by Galileo Galilei, who published a major work that ended up getting him condemned by the Catholic Inquisition. And he was imprisoned, actually, and under house arrest for the final 10 years of his life. And Giordano Bruno, another Catholic priest, a Dominican priest, just as St. Thomas Aquinas was 3 centuries earlier, went even farther, and he dared to assert that our sun itself was not the center of the universe, but that in fact our sun was like the other millions of stars, and that many of these other millions of stars had planets going around them as our Earth went around our sun, even to the point of asserting that he believed that there may well be other living beings on the planets that actually orbited these other stars. Now, this was in 1584, which, of course, as you remember, earned him a burning at the stake, actually, by the Catholic Church in 1600 to welcome in the new century. Now, Giordano Bruno went even farther with regard to his findings to set forth an entire alternative philosophy for the Catholic Church, arguing that there was some form of subtle energy that bonded all of the universe together into one harmonious whole, and that therefore everything in the universe was part of a divine unity. And he denied the existence of some other noun-like God who had created the universe, and therefore he earned quite substantially the condemnation of the Catholic Church, because it was completely antithetical to the entire set of theology that had been developed by the Catholic Church. And this entire philosophy was later developed into a much more thoroughgoing analysis by Spinoza. But tonight is not a night for discussing all of the philosophies of all of these different people. The bottom line is that this philosophy that Spinoza was talking about and Giordano Bruno was talking about was directly contrary to an entire different philosophy that had been developed by Descartes, who asserted that there was a radical separation between the material world and any purported spiritual realm, and that this opened the door to the world of science to actually seize upon this material world and basically, eventually, in our lifetimes, end up coming to deny the actual existence of any other realm other than the material universe. And so that this is the philosophy that gave rise to scientific materialism in the radical scientific, logical, positivist worldview that guides not only the world of science, but the academy in all of Western culture. This is what is taught to us. This is what is taught to our children and our grandchildren in the academies now. That any of this talk about spirituality in these subtle realms is in fact magical thinking. That they've in fact developed this into an entire postmodern worldview, which basically asserts that subsequent to the discovery of quantum physics, that you can actually divide the material realm into smaller and smaller and smaller integers, that every single compound can be divided into the separate elements. Every element can be divided into atoms. Every atom can be divided into nuclei with their protons and neutrons and electrons. Every one of these can be subdivided into muons and leptons, etc. And they can eventually be subdivided into inchoate quantum fields, which actually disappear from any material manifestation whatsoever. And so therefore, they argue that nothing, no thing, actually has any ultimate substantive value in the universe. This is the entire postmodern worldview that is afflicting the academy at the present time. Now, that you might ask yourself, what does all of this have to do with why we're here this weekend? Why is it that the community that is extremely interested in the potential existence of extraterrestrial life, extremely interested in the phenomenon of UFOs, the belief that there are actual vehicles from an extraterrestrial civilization that are being staffed and piloted into our world, in landing and actually having direct contact with members of our human family. And yet, the academy, as was the example with Dr. John Mack, as you all know, back in 1994, that Harvard University, when John Mack wrote a book called Abductions, Human Contact with Aliens, he was dragged before a rump faculty committee and was challenged. He reached out to me to be his attorney in that particular case because I had graduated from Harvard College and graduated from Harvard Law School and had studied for 2 years on my PhD at Harvard Divinity School. So he sought assistance from someone who was familiar with the university to come and assist him. And actually in the meeting when I appeared with him, that they began to try to interrogate him. And so I stopped them and I said to Dr. John Relman, who was the chair of this committee, who had sitting right next to him the attorney from Harvard University, the dean of the medical school, and members of other faculty at the university, sitting arrayed in a major tribunal overlooking him. He started to interrogate Dr. Mack, and I said to him, I said, excuse me, I said, can you please explain to me exactly what it is that we're doing here? Why is it that this tribunal has been convened? Why have they insisted upon Dr. Mack coming before them in response to this book? And Dr. Relman said, well, what happened is when Dr. Mack published this book, the dean of the medical school here began to receive a number of telephone calls, and they were asking him questions, and he found himself unable to really answer these questions. And so he decided he was going to talk with Dr. Mack and ask him some of these questions. And as long as he was going to be doing that, he might just have some other members of the faculty come and participate in this questioning. And so that's what's really brought about this gathering. And so I said, well, actually then, in the spirit of cooperation, could you tell us, who is it that called? And there was this big, long, deadly silence that fell over the hearing room. And the legal counsel for Harvard University turned to Dr. Relman and shook her head like this. And Dr. Ruhlman said, "I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that." I said, "All right, well then, look, in further spirit of cooperation and trying to assist you, can you tell us what were the questions that were asked that we need to answer?" And another deadly silence fell over the room. And the legal counsel shook her head no. He said, "I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that." And so I said, "Well, let me ask this." I said, is it likely that either one or both of the two following factual questions may be at issue here during the course of these hearings, whatever their nature is? Number one, is it possible that any of the so-called UFO sightings might actually be a vehicle from some extraterrestrial civilization that has developed the superluminal technology to be able to come to our planet from their distant solar system? And secondly, is there such a thing as extraterrestrial intelligence? Are either of these questions likely to be at issue in these hearings? And he said, "Well, they most definitely are, and it's totally ridiculous to think that either one of those things is true." That's what he said. This is 1994, Harvard University, the panel actually declaring that it's totally ridiculous to believe that extraterrestrial intelligence exists anywhere in our entire universe, except here on our planet. So it demonstrates the kind of intensity of this worldview that has been developed over the years of scientific logical positivism or radical materialism, that the only thing that can be believed are those things that can be subjected to our five senses, that we can see or touch or taste or feel or weigh or measure, and that unless that can be done, then not only do we say that we haven't been able to discern it yet, what we say is it doesn't exist. And that's the worldview that is at the base of the refusal of the scientific community for many years until just the past recent decade to have asserted that it's ridiculous to think that extraterrestrial intelligence exists because we haven't encountered them. Now, this, of course, has led to a radical effort on the part of the entire constabulary in the established order in Western civilization, denying the factuality of incident after incident after incident, after videotape, after completely credible accounts on the part of military officers who recount UFOs coming over their Minuteman missile site, turning off the missiles, constituting in their judgment a very serious threat to national security from their particular perspective, and still nothing is done about it, except they send the commanding officer to Dr. John Mack to have his head examined to determine whether or not he's having some sort of a psychotic breakdown, as are the other people that were at the site at the same time. Okay? That this is the challenge that has confronted that portion of our human family that has been fascinated by this phenomenon. The phenomenon not only of the UFOs that have progressed from being these extraordinarily magical type lights in the sky that go through types of actions that seem to be impossible for any type of craft that is actually contains a living human being, but have actually then become clearly manifest vehicles, then are reported to have landed and extraterrestrial beings come out of them and actually had direct communications with other human beings, like police officers, high school teachers, even lawyers who come forward and assert that this is true, which is not the best possible thing for their legal career. And so that this extraordinary disconnect that we have experienced over the past 70 years at least, that has characterized this particular field. And that has, of course, whetted the appetite of those of us who are extraordinarily fascinated by this entire event. But the unfortunate fact is that it has has drawn a significant amount of our energy off toward being really upset with government officials and our government and our religious institutions, because we have become convinced that they certainly must know that this is going on. In fact, Richard Dolan has spent the time putting together 2 major volumes of the formerly classified internal documentation inside the Defense Department, inside the various military agencies, the Air Force, the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, detailing specific accounts of these events and insisting that something be done about this, that some major investigations be conducted, that some steps be taken by our government in a formal way to ascertain what this phenomenon is, even to the point of General Twining, as the commander of the United States Air Force, the chief of staff, insisting that he believed that these vehicles were from an extraterrestrial civilization and that we had to start to come to grips with this, which was steadily ignored as far as people have been able to tell from the documents that so far have been released through the Freedom of Information Act. So that this particular state of mind has obtained for the last 70 years at least, since Roswell, which is, as we all know, the sort of a gold standard of one of these events, with literally 100 or more eyewitnesses now having been interviewed, giving great details of this, including my own personal experience when I was delivering a presentation to the International UFO Congress. I think it must have been around 2000, 2001, some 15 years ago. And a fellow came up out of the audience and pulled me aside and told me that he had located the photographer who took the famous photograph of General Ramey and Jesse Marcel, kneeling before this weather balloon debris that General Ramey insisted that the local newspaper come and photograph at 2 o'clock in the morning so they could stomp out the flurry of stories that were going around, because Jesse Marcel had issued the public press release that they had recovered a flying saucer that had crashed in the area. And so this famous photograph had been taken and was put on the front page of the local paper the next morning to dispel all of those rumors that were flying around. And it turns out that this young fellow came up out of the audience and said he'd located the photographer that took the picture, and he wanted to know, based upon my previous experience as conducting investigations in the Karen Silkwood case, the Iran-Contra case, various murder cases ranging like from the Eddie Carthan case and the case of the Greensboro Ku Klux Klan that murdered the labor organizers down there in 1979. I'd had a lot of experience in doing those kind of professional investigations. So he wanted to have my advice as to what he should do. So what I did is I set it aside, and Jordy Peace was there with me. And what we said is, look, if you will go and talk to him, that I will contact a person that I know who might fund actually getting, if you can possibly find the negatives of that photograph. And the likelihood is that he took more than one photograph. In what we might be able to do, because one of the things that you recognize in the photograph is that General Ramey, who is kneeling down, overseeing this debris, is holding in his hand a telegram of some sort. And you can see it from a distance in the photograph. And I said, if we can possibly get the negatives of this, we can digitize them and expand these. And so he agreed to do this, went and met with this photographer. Indeed, the photographer had in his lab at his home the negatives, the original negatives of several photographs that he indeed had taken. And we got those digitized and blown up and then subjected to computer analysis for the portions of the telegram that you could see. And it actually said that he was given orders to remove the craft and the bodies that had been recovered from the craft and to bring them to Wright Airfield. And so there it was, right in front of us. And yet, when confronted with that type of empirical evidence that would put many a defendant in federal prison if presented in a trial to an objective jury, the entire system just closed down in the face of that and does not want to talk about this. So because of this experience that we've had over the past 70 years, that we have, as I said, spent an awful lot of time challenging the integrity of the government, accusing them of conspiracies to conceal this information, going farther to charge them with having taken the vehicles and back engineered them, and not only engaged in my lab activities of kidnapping people and pretending they were extraterrestrials, flying these around in public and causing everybody to have a big stir, and even to the point of allegedly having some secret space program where they've actually used these vehicles to engage in superluminal flight and have gone to Mars and even other solar systems. So that what's happened is that the intensity with which we have felt ourselves to be offended by the conduct of not only the government, but any type of secret cabal that resides behind the official government, and including our religious communities, who we assume must know about this as well. We have spent a good deal of our time and energy directed toward our displaying our contempt, actually, for these government agencies and their lack of credibility. And because of that, we have not spent the kind of time that I think the subject itself merits for us to pay attention to exactly what does this mean? What does this mean for us as a human family? What is the impact of this type of reality if we assume that at least some of the hundreds and hundreds of sightings of these vehicles, that at least some of them are in fact a craft from an extraterrestrial civilization, and that there is therefore an extraterrestrial civilization that has developed superluminal travel, that they've come and go from our planet, and that what are the implications for our creation myth, for our view of ourselves, not just this particular theistic creation myth, but for virtually any one of the entire octave of thoroughgoing and systematic human worldviews that our family has developed, every single one of which shares at least one common characteristic, and that is they all assume that our human family is in fact the only sentient being in the universe. So why is it that we have not yet spent the kind of time and energy and resources that are necessary to try to turn our attention away from this kind of dialectical confrontation with the government agencies, in investigating them and trying to get them, worse yet, to come forward and admit what they've been doing? The constant quest for disclosure on their part, that somehow they're supposed to have a radical change of heart all of a sudden and come forward and confess that they've been doing this and somehow ask for our forgiveness, which would distinguish it from every other covert operation, every other sinful activity that they've been engaged in, during our entire lifetimes. So that's not very likely that that's going to happen. But the reason that I raise these issues with us tonight, on this weekend, when we're gathered here together, is because something has happened in just the past several years that radically alters the situation. And that is that the scientific community and the government agencies of the Western powers have in fact engaged in a process of constructing and orbiting space-based telescopes, which are now able, first the Hubble, then the Kepler, then the Planck telescope, that these telescopes have now been able to turn their focus onto the distant stars and have been able now to identify for the very first time through scientific, logical, positivist procedures the existence of other planets. And so what we have for the very first time, as extraordinary as that sounds, for the very first time in history, we have a substantial plurality of the scientific community acknowledging that there are other planets. And in fact, this led to, in November of 2009, the Vatican convening a major gathering of some 40 world scientists in bringing them to Castle Gandolfo in Rome, just outside of Rome, where the Pontifical Observatory is, and bringing these scientists together to brief the high-level people in the Vatican, including Pope Benedict at the time, briefing them on the discoveries that are being made with regard to these exoplanets, and letting them know that they believe that when, in fact, the James Webb Telescope is put into orbit in 2018, and the new telescope that is based in Chile, that has a filter on it, which is able to now filter out the brilliance of the star and actually be able to see the planets as they orbit these distant stars. Because the Hubble, all it was able to do is to discern the dimming of a star, which they interpreted scientifically as being a planet passing between the star and the lens of the telescope, and that therefore they hypothesized the existence of these planets. But now they've been able to see the planets, now with the Planck telescope and the Kepler telescope. And now they're actually going to be able to see the planets, and they're going to be able to download digitally all of the data that is flowing from the surface of the planet. They're going to be able to put it through spectroscopes and be able to determine what the chemical makeup of the atmosphere is, and what the landmass looks like, and actually develop photographs of the surface of the planets. This is the type of technology that has been developed now by our human family. And because of this, when the Vatican was briefed about this being in the offing, what they did is they convened an official press conference at the Vatican on November 10th of 2009 that was chaired by Cardinal Marcelo Sanchez Sordano, who is the head of the Pontifical Academy of Science, and it was co-hosted by Jesuit priest and an astronomer, the director of the Pontifical Observatory, Father Jose Gabriel Funes. And they announced that in light of the now recent discoveries made in the field of astronomy, that it was now clear that much sooner than anyone had previously anticipated, it was now much more likely than not that we were going to be discovering the existence of life elsewhere in the universe. That was the term that they used. They simply referred to it as life itself. And they said, in light of this upcoming discovery, the time has now arrived to begin a very serious discussion of the profound philosophical and theological questions that are posed to our human family by the discovery of life elsewhere in the universe. Now, I took it upon myself as the former 10-year chief counsel to the United States Jesuit Headquarters National Office of Social Ministry in Washington, D.C., to go and talk with Father Funes and sat down with him and asked him whether or not, when he was referring to life, was he referring simply to the discovery of some microscopic single-celled amoeba of some sort, or bacterium, beneath the frozen sea of some distant moon surrounding or orbiting some planet in the distance. And he said, well, that would be important to many of the scientists to discover that. But what he was really interested in was the potential discovery of another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed, but distinctly non-human species in the universe. This is the issue that is going to be confronting the church This is the discovery that is going to be confronting the scientific community. This is the discovery that is going to be confronting the age-old developed human mythology that has substituted our previous belief that we existed in the physical center of the entire universe, which was created just as the stage upon which to play out our human drama, to now believing that, or amending it after Galileo and Copernicus, into believing that we're just at the very apex of the pyramid of all evolved life in the universe. And it's now clear that we are at high risk of being disenthroned from the apex of the pyramid of all biological evolution in the universe. And so, in my judgment, that we therefore, as the community that has been spending a major portion of the last 70 years, fascinated by this question of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and these UFO vehicles and what our relationship is with them, that we, in fact, now are confronted with the challenge not only of turning our attention to this serious discussion of the profound philosophical and theological questions that are posed to us, questions that we have been giving, in my opinion, short shrift to in lieu of our constant fixation with confronting the government and demanding disclosure and investigating this almost like it's a criminal investigation, trying to show that they're lying to us. And so that we are not only confronted now with this question of identifying these profound philosophical and theological questions, but also answering them. But very importantly, we are now confronted with a very important political question. And that is this, is that are we going to participate with them in what many people are going to view as, in effect, a charade? That they are in the process of getting ready to recognize one exoplanet system after another, one which eventually will be discovered to harbor microbiotic life beneath the sea of some moon, to then more complex life that exists in the sea, more complex life that appears to be some sort of amphibian of sorts, to the point where they get up into land-based creatures, and to eventually identify some type of a primitive, intelligent being that is distinctly non-human. That is clear that they are in the process now of developing this, because Father Funes, who was the director of the Pontifical Observatory, who co-chaired the official Vatican press conference on November 10th of 2009, has now, with the blessing, first of Pope Benedict, and then of Pope Francis, and with the blessing of Cardinal Sordano, the head of the Pontifical Academy of Science, has been given their blessing to now have a professorship at the Jesuit University in Cordoba, in Argentina, and is now teaching the very first class on the university level of the profound philosophical and theological questions posed to our human family by the discovery of not amoebas or bacteria, but the discovery of another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed but distinctly non-human species in our universe. And he is going to be coming to the United States on August 31st, and he is going to be in residence at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, and he is going to be working with the New Paradigm Institute to convene these serious discussions. And they are reaching out to experts around the world in the fields of philosophy, in the fields of biology, in the fields of psychology, in the fields of theology, to bring these people together to try to not only identify these philosophical and theological questions, but to try to pose potential answers to them so that those answers can be woven together to constitute a new post-contact human worldview. And and we are in effect being invited to participate in that. That we are going to be able to participate in deciding who the people are that are going to come to these discussions, what the nature of the discussions are going to be, what type of publicity is going to be generated around these discussions, etc. And so that the question is posed to our community now, for the first time, of whether or not we are going to participate in this process, by means of which the established order of the ruling class on our planet, made up of political leadership, cultural leadership, scientific leadership, and religious leadership, are going to be evolving a human worldview which is prepared to identify how we are to be integrated into this larger cosmic vision. And so that the question is, are we going to participate in that in light of the fact that it appears that they are going to continue, while they're doing this, to refuse to acknowledge that any contact has ever been made, and are going to continue to refuse to acknowledge that any UFOs have ever come to our planet, are going to continue to refuse that any human being has ever had any direct contact with any extraterrestrial being. And so that they seem to be perfectly willing to participate in this kind of prospective discussion about the philosophical and theological implications of this, unto constructing a worldview which you can be completely certain is going to leave them in charge. That the type of acknowledgments that they're likely to make sitting around that table is going to, in fact, have to be very careful about threatening the basic official principles of the Roman Catholic Church, of the major Protestant churches, the Jewish synagogues, their entire theology. Is going to have to be very careful not to threaten the scientific community by pushing them too far beyond what it is they're willing to acknowledge, because they've actually tasted it and touched it and weighed it. And they're going to be very careful not to threaten the political constabulary. Okay? Now, the question is, are we going to participate in that process, fully cognizant of the fact that the answers that they're going to be providing to these questions are incrementally different from the answers that they have posed to those questions in the past? And therefore, we're going to be participating in a process that's very similar to, let's say, Hillary Clinton, in dealing with the major corporations, the major financial institutions, the major political powers and invested interests of wealth that reside behind the scenes, and that she is, in fact, participating with them. And she's asserting, on the one hand, that she perfectly wishes to have the same kind of objectives that in fact Bernie Sanders is proposing, but that just isn't realistic, because the other people won't agree to it. And so therefore, we can only get the kind of changes that a right-wing, Republican-controlled House of Representatives is willing to agree to. And so that not only will she not propose the ideal, she will in fact propose only what it is she thinks they'll agree with. So you see, this is in fact a process of potential social change that is advocated by the liberal worldview. That one has to be realistic about the nature of reality at any given point in time. One has to be realistic about the nature of power, the power that they wield, the control that they exercise. And yet you are providing an important service, they argue, by incrementally moving in the direction of what you might identify as the ideal that you would like to achieve. Or are we going to, as a community, instead conduct ourselves like Bernie Sanders? And that what we're going to do is say, look, we're not going to participate in constructing some completely compromised worldview that in fact accommodates the kind of preposterous propositions that you people have held on to ever since the Middle Ages in the Catholic Church. And we're not going to hold on to the kind of ridiculous decisions that you made based in the 17th and 18th century of having a form of merely representational government that in fact, enshrines the elite, that in fact places the elite in positions of extreme privilege and power, even within the context of the American Constitution, which is why we still today don't vote for the president. We vote for electors. And you can hear the debate going on right now between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders about these superdelegates that have been handpicked by the Democratic Party to make the decision ultimately as to who the candidate is going to be, that in fact over 400 of them were openly and publicly committed to vote for Hillary Clinton before there was even another candidate announced for the Democratic nomination. Okay? So that this type of fundamental compromise with the elite and the powerful, because virtually every single one of those superdelegates who are made up of Democratic members of Congress, the House and the Senate, the Democratic governors, the Democratic lieutenant governors, every single one of them is completely dependent upon their campaign being financed by the same financial interests that are financing Hillary Clinton's campaign. We're getting $15 million from the pharmaceutical industry, the petrochemical industry, the petroleum industry, the insurance industry. And so when she says, I'd really like to have a single-payer health system, but what we're really going to have is subsidizing the insurance industry, putting billions of dollars of tax money into the hands of the insurance industry, who just totally coincidentally contribute to my campaign. But I want to make it clear, are you suggesting that that's going to influence my judgment? And so what I'm saying is that you might think that what I'm suggesting is that the answer to this question is very simple. But it's important for us all to recognize, and I know it's going to make you feel bad, that Bernie Sanders is not going to be the Democratic Party nominee. And he's not going to be president of the United States. Hillary Clinton is. In the same way that Donald Trump is not going to be president of the United States, because the same organized power is not going to tolerate him being the Republican president. Okay? And so that what we really need to understand is that our human family has an option that has been developed over time, which is one that we have to consider, which is that there is a process by means of which incremental change can be made in giving full recognition to the reality of the present power systems on the planet. And yet the people who are idealists look at that and view this as the very means by which fundamental change never happens. Okay? So that what I'm suggesting is that we as a community are confronted by, in my opinion, a political question that we have to decide. And it won't be completely decided just by those of us who have gathered here for this weekend, though that is what we are going to be looking toward in the workshops that I'm going to be presenting here. That I want us to discuss the implications of either one of these two particular choices and options that we have. How would we go about participating in this process that Father Funes is going to be engaged in, that has got the blessings of the Pope, has got the blessings of the head of the Pontifical Academy of Science, is going to be having world-renowned scientists and philosophers and theologians from the entire academy in Western civilization and Eastern civilization coming to participate in these conversations. Do we want to participate in those conversations and assist in the process of moving that new worldview as far as we can in the direction of an ideal vision for the worldview? Or do we want to, in fact, work among ourselves to develop a completely idealistic worldview that is not compromised by having to give undue respect to doctrines of the churches that have been developed since the Middle Ages to basically put the church in a position of power over us? For example, one of the first conversations that I had with Father Funes is his willingness to discuss having to amend the Catholic Church doctrine on Gnosticism, which is a critical issue about whether or not we as human beings have access to the evolution of a faculty by means of which we can directly, experientially encounter the unitive phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe into one harmonic whole, and that we can experientially experience ourselves as unified and in perfect harmony with the universe. And from that perspective, make moral choices by deciding what form of human conduct, individual or collective, is either harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe. Because that is an undertaking that the Catholic Church has denied to the laity. They have superimposed themselves between the laity and the infinite and eternal numinous experience, and have insisted that they be the arbiters of those moral questions. Okay? And the same thing is true with the political realm, that they have interposed between the people and the policies that are going to be made, both in foreign policy and domestic policy, in economic policy. They have interposed this elite group of a ruling class between the people and those decisions. Okay, so are we in fact going to in fact figure out together what exactly the implications would be in concrete terms of how we might go about participating in such a process, fully cognizant of the fact that the ultimate product is going to be, at least in substantial part, unsatisfactory to us? Or are we going to, in fact, exercise the Bernie Sanders option and undertake the kind of responsibility that we would have to undertake to engage in that process ourselves? And the reason that I point out that I believe that the answer is not a foregone conclusion is because take a look at the degree of responsibility and actual participation that the vast majority of people actually are worthy of doing. You know, most people don't pay adequate attention to actually participating in public decision making. They're completely passive about this. And so that they go in and they either get a copy of the Good Times that tells them how to vote, you know, or the local paper that tells them how to vote, or they look to the Democratic Party that tells them who the candidates are that they don't know, they wouldn't recognize them on the street. You know, that is how the vast majority of our people, even in the most advanced democratic or pseudo-democratic society that our human family has been able to develop, that is how we conduct ourselves. So what I'm suggesting is that it isn't a simple foregone conclusion that we are in any way prepared, even within our community of the people that are fascinated by the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and UFOs, to actually do the type of hard lifting and heavy lifting that is going to be necessary to do that. And so that we end up being like, you know, like some of the radical student groups that used to be. They stand up in a meeting and rant and rave against any kind of a compromised situation. And then when it comes time to whether they're willing to do the work, they turn around and leave. You know, so that this is an important political question, I'm suggesting, that we are now confronted by. Now, we can ignore it. We can pretend it doesn't exist. We can continue to spend the bulk of our time challenging the government and its integrity looking for every example we can of how they've deceived us and how they lied. We can, in fact, actually spin out entire fantasies, if you will forgive me for saying so, based on complete abject speculation about, secret space programs and how they've gone off to other solar systems and, are lying to us, etc., because it satisfies our anger at how unpleased we are with the way that they have manipulated us and deceived us. Now, we can continue to spend our time doing that, and people may choose to do that because there's a certain kind of apparent satisfaction that people get from that because they spend such a large percentage of their energy doing it. But there is this other task at hand, and we know perfectly well that the task is going forward, that there is a process now underway in Western civilization to develop a post-contact human worldview. Okay, and that what I'm telling you is that I believe that we have the ability to participate in this if we choose to do so with them. And we also, however, have the opportunity to exercise the Bernie Sanders option and actually undertake the process of developing idealistic and ideal answers to these questions and not be satisfied with the kind of answers that are going to be provided by the established order, which have a subtext for keeping them in power. Okay, so I wanted to introduce the subject to you here tonight so that you'll know what it is that we're going to be doing in our workshops. And there are lots of other workshops that you can go to. You can go to workshops on the secret space program. You can go to workshops on, what the conspiracies are that the government is engaged in, which are very real. Or you can come to these workshops and actually participate in helping to make this type of a political decision as to which option you want to exercise and receive some important discussions about what each of them would be like in a really practical way. I've spent my entire 45 years of a professional legal career working in this exact area of trying to make these types of decisions with regard to given public policy issues, of whether we're going to take an extremely progressive and idealistic position and insist upon that being complied with on the part of the established order, or whether or not we're going to accept, compromises and achieve certain objectives. I've ended up chairing a coalition made up of 80 different national organizations that had the common objective of stopping the passage of Senate Bill 1, which was drafted at the request of Richard Nixon, and he assigned William Rehnquist as a special assistant attorney general, United States Attorney General, to draft an entire alternative federal criminal code that was completely reactionary, that could have in fact been passed in Germany in 1936. In fact, they went forward and did that. And that we were confronted by how we're going to deal with that. Are we going to, for example, draft our own completely alternative federal criminal code, countering theirs, putting in a progressive solution to every single one of the criminal questions that are asked, or are we going to just figure out how to stop them from doing what they're doing? That in the Karen Silkwood case, we ended up not being allowed to put evidence into the federal court as to who killed Karen Silkwood that night on the highway on November 13th of 1973. But at the same time, the court entered an order declaring unconstitutional the financial cap that Congress had put on at the behest of the petroleum companies that owned most of the nuclear power plants. They had put a financial cap on the amount of damages that could be awarded by an American jury for the release of radioactive materials into their neighborhood. And we got that declared unconstitutional. And since that ruling in June of 1979, not a single private nuclear power plant has been built in the United States. Okay, now, but I will tell you, it wasn't because we agreed to compromise. We fought them every inch of the way down the line to insist upon being able to put that evidence of who killed her and why they did it into evidence. In fact, a funny story, we got to the Judge Tice, when he was the federal judge, the third federal judge on that case. We had struck two previous federal judges for bias in this bloodbath that we had, trying to get discovery about what had happened to Karen Silkwood. And we finally had Judge Tice, who came from the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. He was assigned to come into to Oklahoma to try the case. And when Glenn Whitaker, the lawyer for the FBI, who had been involved in wiretapping and conducting surveillance against Karen Silkwood illegally and unconstitutionally, when he rose and said, "Oh, Judge Tice, we'd like to welcome you here to the state of Oklahoma," Judge Tice leaned over and he said, "Mr. Whitaker, is it? Sit down and shut up." He said, "The way this case has been handled up to this point in time raises fundamental questions about the basic fairness of the American judicial system. And I am going to, from this point forward, give these young lawyers around the country the opportunity to get the discovery to which they're entitled under the law. And we're either going to lay Karen Silkwood to rest once and for all, or she's going to get up and walk in this courtroom." So we said to ourselves, thank God. Good, we've got an honest judge here. And so when we discovered, during our discovery, that they were in fact smuggling 98% pure bomb-grade plutonium out of the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility in Cimarron, Oklahoma, and smuggling it to Israel and to Iran at the same time, and sharing it with South Africa, with the apartheid government, and with Brazil, the fascists in Brazil that had been secreted inside their governments when fleeing from Nazi Germany at the end of the war, that this is what was going on. When we submitted that affidavit to Judge Tice called me up the following Monday morning and said, "Mr. Shehan, I want you in my courtroom tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I have felt compelled to share your affidavit with Mr. Whitaker of the FBI, and he has reached out to me and said that the Central Intelligence Agency would like to send two of their top lawyers out to talk with me in camera without you being notified about it. But I feel compelled to tell you that it's happening. I want you in my courtroom. I'm not going to allow you to participate in the hearing. I want you here." So I showed up the next morning, and I was sitting there, and in comes Glenn Whitaker with these two CIA lawyers, and they walk in, and Judge Tice says, "Mr. Shehan, I want it on the record that you've been notified about this. I know you object to it." And I said, "I most certainly do," and vehemently. He said, "Yes, vehemently. That's a matter of record. But I'm going to go in and listen to what they have to say." And he goes in, and within 5 minutes, Cy Hirsch, the investigative reporter at that time from the New York Times, comes rushing into the courtroom. This was the Oklahoma Federal Courthouse that was later bombed. This is in 1979. He comes rushing in and he says, "Danny, what's going on? I just got a notice that the top lawyers for the CIA are coming out here." And I told him exactly what was going on. New York Times reporter sat there, told him, showed him a copy of the affidavit, the detailed proof of what they were doing. He said, "Oh my God," he said, "they're not going to let that come into this record. And the New York Times is not going to publish it. This is just like the Kennedy assassination," he said. "They're not going to talk about what really happened." And sure enough, out comes Judge Tice 15 minutes later, and he gets up on the bench, and on the record, he says to us, he says, "Mr. Shehan, you can be certain that it's sinister, but it's also most definitely secret. This is just a glass mountain that you're not going to be allowed to climb in this case. And I'm at this point taking judicial notice of the fact that your count one that accuses all of these defendants at the Kerr-McGee Security Department, the FBI, and the others who are involved in this, of a conspiracy to violate the civil rights of Ms. Silkwood. I'm taking judicial notice of the fact that the Federal Civil Rights Act was passed in 1868 at the immediate conclusion of the American Civil War, and I'm taking further judicial notice of the fact that the American Civil War was fought solely for the purpose of freeing the black race from slavery. And nowhere within the four corners of your complaint do you allege that Ms. Silkwood is a member of the Negro race. And I am ruling that the Federal Civil Rights Act protects only black people. And therefore, whatever the violations of her rights might have been, that she has no standing being a non-member of the Negro race, to raise objections. Now he said, I'm aware of the fact that you object to this. I said, I most certainly do. Vigorously, he said. I said, yes, vigorously. And he said, and I'm willing to sign a special order for an emergency appeal to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And if the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals supports you and reverses me on that, I will reinsert that count 1 into this trial, which we're going to start a week from now, and we will try that count. But if they don't rule on this, we're going forward with count 2, which is your tort claim for the contamination of her home and the radioactive contamination of her. He said, and I want you to be aware of the fact that this court is going to be very, very liberal in its rulings on your behalf with regard to that second count. But this other count is just a glass mountain that you're not going to be allowed to climb. Okay? So even the judge that came in asserting that he was here to do true justice, when he is confronted by one of the underlying facts of the secret covert world, he cringes in the face of it and shrinks from his previous courage. And that we know that that is how the people that are in positions of power get into positions of power. They cringe in the face of the revelation of the secrets. And so that we know that there is another way of going about it. So that when we got to the closing arguments, we got ready to do the closing argument, and we had the 3 Silkwood children sitting in the front row, right in front of the jury. And Bill Paul, who was representing the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation, runs up to the bench and says, Judge Tice, I want to object to these children being here. I think those are the Silkwood children. Judge said, let's go into chambers on this. So we go into chambers, and Judge Tice is sitting there, and Bill Paul, the president of the Oklahoma State Bar Association, says, Your Honor, he said, I object to these children being put in front of the jury. I'm assuming they're the Silkwood children. They're not the plaintiffs in this case. Technically, the plaintiff is the estate of Karen Silkwood. I guess they're the heirs to the estate. I don't quite know how to refer to them. And Judge Tice looks down his glasses and he says, how about incipient millionaires? He said. And he said, moreover, he said, now that I have you in chambers here, Mr. Paul, I'm going to tell you, if in your closing argument you so much as hint that Karen Silkwood did not have the documents in her possession that were taken by the Kerr-McGee people from her car after her death, you so much as hint that she didn't have those documents, I'm going to stop your closing argument. I'm going to allow Mr. Shehan to reinsert count 1 into this case. And let me tell you that based on 40 years as a trial attorney in the federal court system, if that evidence goes into this case in front of this jury, he said, this jury is going to conclude that the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation murdered Karen Silkwood. And yet, he did not do it. He did not put that count back in. And that's something that we have to thoroughly understand. So we left that courtroom with the jury verdict of a $10.5 million judgment that broke the $10 million limit that was imposed by Congress, and the judge declared that ceiling to be unconstitutional. And as I said, not a single other private nuclear power plant has been built in the United States since that day. And so that we have achieved something of major significance. And yet we never gave in. We never gave in. We stood and fought for our ideals. So what we want to do is, in our workshops here, the remaining 3 workshops that I'm going to be having here, I want us to talk about this. I want us to discuss how it is that we would go about participating with these major decision makers in Western civilization and in Eastern civilization, that to formulate a post-contact worldview that may well be compromised and not what we want ideally, or in the alternative, how we would actually concretely go about designing and identifying a genuinely new post-contact human worldview that values our human species, but understands the actual situation in which we find ourselves, so that we are not confronted by the traditional example of history when a much more technically advanced civilization encounters a more primitive civilization, such as finding a tribe in the jungles of New Guinea that hasn't had any contact with a more advanced civilization. The minute that that happens, within months, their entire culture collapses, and their sense of self-identity is destroyed. And we do not want to have that experience. And those of us in the room here today, and here this weekend, and others of us that are in this particular community, that we have a unique capacity to determine whether or not we are willing and capable of developing a genuinely unconditioned post-contact human worldview that will enable us to survive such a potential encounter, that will in fact set forth a merit that our human family has that entitles us to a legitimate partnership in the cosmic civilization. And that is what we need to do. And we need to determine whether we want our representatives in such a participation in a cosmic civilization to be our regular people or the same people that have represented us down through the years. Okay? That's a choice that you have, that you can make. And I'm simply here to present the opportunity to you this weekend to participate in that political discussion and to participate in the discussion of what you believe the fundamental philosophical questions are, and the theological questions are, and the public policy questions are, that we are going to be confronted with when we discover this civilization in an official manner. Okay? So that's the reason I'm here tonight. And as they say in the Lakota language, that's all I have to say. Okay? Yeah. Now we have a few more, just a few minutes. It's now 8:30. We have a few more minutes before Robert is going to start singing to you. So there may be a couple pressing questions that I want to answer. Then we'll have to make room. Yes.
Two-part question. First part is, what do you sincerely believe the Vatican knows? And two, why now? While it's a public discussion, politically, religious institutions, and socially, why now?
Okay. Let me repeat the question. It's a two-part question. What is it that I personally believe the Vatican knows and understands about this subject at the present time? And secondly, what was it? The second? Yeah, why now? Okay, let me take the second part first. The why now is because of the technology that's been developed and the space-based telescopes that are actually discovering these planets, and that they're going to be able to find out whether there is life on these planets. And it's going to take place right within perhaps the next decade. Okay, so we're looking at a very short window here for this type of a discovery. Okay, and secondly, the first part of your question, what do I personally believe that they know? What I would say is that, I guess what I say to clients like this, I don't get paid to guess. You know, what I do is we get contributions to find out. That's what the Christic Institute did. That's what the Romero Institute does. If people want to get the answers to these questions, we are perfectly capable of getting it. But it requires support from people like you and other people. That, you know, we live on a pittance, but the fact is we hire professional investigators, you know, who in fact rent cars, you know, stay in Motel 6s, you know, fly on airplanes to go get the answers to these questions. So this is not inexpensive. Karen Silkwood case cost us almost $6 million to do that. We happened to win $10.5 million in the judgment, but the Iran-Contra case cost us almost $8 million. Okay? But the fact of the matter is we stopped the supply of military equipment to the Contras. We exposed what was going on in the Reagan-Bush administration. We ultimately stopped George H.W. Bush from gaining a second term in office. There are things that were achieved by this, and we need to always ask ourselves, was it worth it? Was it worth that effort? I think it was. I think it was. Okay? And so that we can do this. We can do this with the support and participation, not just the financial contributions that you get a tax deduction for, but participation. People have particular skills They have particular contacts and information. This has to be a community effort if we're going to do option 2. If we're going to do option 2, it is all hands on deck. And we need to come to understand what is going on with the church right now. Why is it Pope Francis has issued the papal encyclical on global climate change? Why is it, he said in the papal encyclical, that the proximate causation of the global climate change that we're experiencing is transnational corporate capitalism? And that we have to come to grips with this. You know, why is it that he's saying things like that now? Why now? Mainly because we're facing disaster with regard to the global climate change. And we're on the very brink of potentially facing a substantial trauma of the encounter of an extraterrestrial civilization, which may lead the officials to conceal it from us if we don't demonstrate that we're capable of integrating that information. Okay? So that's why now. Okay? So look, thank you for coming. We're going to have we have the next workshop tomorrow at 7 o'clock, the same time as tonight, and it's going to be in Friendship Hall. And then on Sunday, we have the workshop. I think it's at 2 o'clock, I think. You can find it, if anybody can read that little thing that you got that tells where everything is. Is anybody here can actually read that? Because I want to hire you right away. But anyway, there's ways that you can find out what, but I believe it's 2 o'clock in Friendship Hall as well. And then we have the 3-hour intensive on Monday that goes from 1:30 to 4:30. Okay? And this is not to give short shrift to the other people who have intensives at the same time, but I just want you to decide what your priorities are, whether or not you think this is worth your time and energy here this weekend, and your other friends who are here, to tell them what it is that we're going to be doing in that workshop and see if they want to participate. Okay? There it is. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolutely fabulous. We are going to have our Meet Your Speakers party coming up, and Danny's going to be around to say hi and answer some questions, and you'll meet your other speakers, and we start that at 9 o'clock, so come on back and enjoy our Meet Your Speakers, and we'll see you soon.